I wonder how you would react if you heard that one of your family members was going to go and live in Somalia. Somalia, one of the world's most dangerous countries. The Foreign Office says we advise against all travel to Somalia. There is a very high threat of kidnapping, terrorist attack and violent crime. There is no effective police force. Lawlessness, violent crime, banditry and looting are common. How would I feel if my 20-year-old daughter said, "I'm going backpacking to Somalia"? I would hide her passport. And yet, if a friend, a family member said they were going to live in Singapore, from a safety angle, we would have no concerns, would we? Because that country has a well-established legal system, it has an efficient police force, they are tough on crime, but there is little crime. Singapore is one of the safest countries in the world. Law and order is good, isn't it? Because law and order protects us. God's law and order is good. But as we're going to see this morning, it is even more wonderful than I imagined. We're in the Sermon on the Mount. Sometimes it's called the Manifesto of the Kingdom. So Jesus, not a politician, Jesus the King. If Jesus is the King, what will it look like to be a member of his kingdom? What impact will we as kingdom people have on the rest of the world? And Jesus answers these questions in the Sermon on the Mount, but actually he says we should know the answer already because we have the Old Testament. And you might remember from a couple of weeks ago that I likened the Old Testament to a holiday brochure. So the brochure points forward with lots of pictures to the holiday. The brochure tells us what the holiday is going to be like. The brochure describes the sort of people that will enjoy going on this holiday. The holiday simply fulfills what is in the brochure. At the back, the holiday brochure has terms and conditions. It tells us how it will be appropriate to behave on the holiday. It tells us what happens when things go wrong. The Old Testament, of course, tells us what the kingdom of Jesus is going to be like. And similarly, the Old Testament, as we have learnt, contains God's laws. Some people want to ignore the Old Testament. They even think Jesus came to abolish it. No, says Jesus, I have come to take away not the tiniest letter, not the smallest punctuation mark. I haven't come to abolish it. And beginning with our passage today and going on for the next few weeks, Jesus gives us 6 examples of how he has not come to abolish the law, how his laws are permanent, how they apply to all time. So, this morning then, the first of these examples is... Well, we'll see in a moment what the first example is. But first, can I draw your attention to my first heading? God's law is more wonderful than I imagined. I guess most of us at some time or other have thought to ourselves, that person really doesn't like me. That person has it in for me. That person is looking to trip me up, to find fault with me. And sometimes those fears are realised when they say things to us that are very hurtful, or they say something behind our back, or they do something to deliberately harm us. We can sort of imagine what it would be like to live in Somalia. We can imagine what it would be like to live in Singapore. But what would it be like to live in a kingdom where not only did people not harm us physically, but they didn't even think of harming us any way at all? What would it be like to live somewhere like that? Verse 21, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment.' But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment." Again, anyone who says to his brother, "Raca," is answerable to the Sanhedrin. But anyone who says, "You fool," will be in danger of the fire of hell. We remember it well. Years before, God rescued his people out of Egypt. Moses took them through the Red Sea into the Sinai Peninsula on the way to Canaan, the promised land. But in that peninsula, Moses goes up the mountain and he comes down again with God's magnificent law, summarised by the Ten Commandments. This is the way you may safely live in the land that I'm going to give you, God says. And one of those laws can be summarised in the sentence, Exodus 20, "You shall not murder." Now actually we'd seen this law before, because when Noah came out of the ark in Genesis 6, God said then, "You don't murder people." And interestingly, at that time, God authorised the death penalty for murder. Why? Because he values human life so highly. But something had gone wrong down the centuries. Actually, two things had gone wrong. Firstly, people had discovered they couldn't keep this law. Murder kept happening, just as murder keeps happening today. But secondly, and this is Jesus' real point here, when God said, "You don't murder," he meant far more than "you're not to plunge a knife into someone." He actually meant, you are to be the sort of people who don't even think about murder. You don't even think about harming someone, or abusing them, or putting them down. And in this respect, the thing that had gone wrong down the years is that the religious leaders had limited the words "do not murder" to "do not physically murder." No, says Jesus, that misses the point completely. In my kingdom, people are to be completely safe, not just safe from the gun and the knife and the bomb. My people are to be completely safe from every type of harm. Isn't God's law more wonderful than I imagined? You see, human law and order can only protect us from what other people do. I know there are laws of slander and libel and that sort of thing that try and protect us from people saying things against us. But God's law and order intends that I be completely safe. And of course he has the ability to do what no human judge can do, which is to judge other people's intentions, their attitudes, their hearts. Verse 21, yes, people may say, "Don't murder, because you will be subject to judgment," but I tell you, anyone who is angry will be subject to judgment. Now, anyone who uses the word "raca," and that's an Aramaic word of contempt. Now, anyone who calls someone a fool. I'm not talking here about the playful or mild word that we use. We're talking about the abusive word that really hurts. Anyone who says these things, please will you inwardly gasp when I read the next words from verse 22. Anyone who says these things will be in danger of the fire of hell. Anger and verbal abuse would seem to be just as unacceptable as murder in God's kingdom. Just a word on anger. It's true, isn't it, that Jesus was periodically angry. In the Bible, God sometimes expresses his anger. King David in the Psalms says, "Don't I hate those who hate you, O Lord?" But this isn't the anger that Jesus is talking about. This isn't the righteous anger that we properly have against jihadi murderers, or against greed, or injustice, or child sex trafficking. Now what Jesus is talking about by anger is the bitter, resentful, grudge-bearing, all-consuming, bad-tempered, insulting, ugly anger, which is a million miles away from God's righteous anger against sin. God's kingdom is not Somalia. God's kingdom is not even Singapore. No, God's kingdom is much safer than Singapore, because he takes the safety and protection of his people so seriously. His decree is that there should not be the hint of hurting anyone or abusing them or putting them down or making them feel small, never mind murdering them. God's law is more wonderful than I imagined. And so those of us who are part of his kingdom, what is our part to play? What is our responsibility? How should we act? Well, it's utterly obvious, isn't it? But how important are these things for our day-to-day lives? Is this pie in the sky? Is this unrealistic in practice? Well, Jesus gives us two examples just to help us grasp this issue. Verse 23. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you because you've done something to them, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. And you can see from my subheading that I'm suggesting that not only is God's law more wonderful than I imagined, it's also more important than I imagined. In Israel at that time there was one temple, which was in Jerusalem, and periodically you would trek maybe many miles to Jerusalem, to the temple, for you to sacrifice your animal. Now, as we've said before, the sacrifice of animals in the Old Testament was a huge visual aid to show how serious sin was. To point to the fact that sin had consequences. Sin always leads to death. But there would one day be someone who would come to die to take away our sin. So here, God's people were routinely offering their sacrifices, and Jesus is saying, but if you think you can do that at the same time as causing real hurt to other people, I don't think so. This is hypocrisy, isn't it? This is the very thing that Jesus was so fierce with the Pharisees about. It's saying one thing to God, yes, I want to follow you and your ways, but deep within us, having it in for someone else. How important is God's law to our day-to-day lives? Well, it's fundamental, isn't it? So fundamental that it even impacts my relationship with God himself. I cannot hate, I cannot despise, I cannot bear a grudge against my boss, my neighbour, my family member, the person who comes to this church and sits over there. I can't do that and pretend all is okay with me and God. And my second subheading, God's law is more wonderful than I thought and more urgent. Verse 25. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still with him on the way, or he may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. I tell you the truth, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. That sounds complicated, but it isn't really. The illustration is, if you've done something against someone else who then takes you to court, if you know you're in the wrong, what do? You settle out of court, don't you? You settle quickly if you've done something wrong before you get to court. Quickly. The message here is very simple and very, very clear. If I have something against someone, I must sort it out. Urgently. God's law is wonderful. Because in his kingdom, not only will he not tolerate physical murder, He will not tolerate anyone looking to harm people in any way. Now again and again I look at God's ways and I become very despondent because it causes me to see that I am not the person I know God wants me to be. I've never thought of myself as a murderer, but I allow these verses to pierce my conscience and I realise I have said things to people I should not have said. I have treated people as I should not have treated them. I have most certainly thought things of people I should not have thought. And I don't know about you, but the thing about thoughts is that they just pop up. And the frightening thing is, those thoughts that pop up show me who I really am. I'm reasonably good, honestly. I'm reasonably good at holding my tongue. But I'm no good at holding my thoughts. Someone upsets me, I shrug it off, and then halfway through shaving, I suddenly realise that I'm thinking about that person and how I'm going to put them right, and worse. Where did those thoughts come from? And scarily, they came from me. I showed you a frightening verse 2 weeks ago. At the beginning of these 6 examples of how God's people lived, I showed you verse 20. Jesus says, "For I tell you that unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." The Pharisees were sticklers for the law. I've got to do better than that. That's how Jesus started this section, but just look how he ends it. Verse 48. He ends this section of 6 little examples by saying, "Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." Can you do that? My second heading, I really hope that most of you know exactly what I'm going to say next. God's law is more wonderful than I imagined, but Christ's good news is therefore more needed than I ever imagined. Passages like this show me that I am more sinful than I ever realised, and therefore in more need of Christ's good news than I ever thought. What is the good news? You know this so well. Jesus came and lived the perfect life. Was Jesus ever spiteful or hurtful or malicious? Did he ever harbour a grudge? Did he look down on people? Did he talk about people behind their back? No, not once. He lived the life I should be living. But Jesus also came and died the death I deserve to die. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Anyone who says to his brother, "Raca," is answerable to the council, the Sanhedrin. Anyone who says, "You fool," will be in danger of the fire of hell. Jesus died the death I deserve to die. Jesus experienced hell, complete separation from God. What is the good news of Jesus? The good news of Jesus is that if I hate, that's a strong word, but it's the right word, if I hate my wrong past, if I loathe those thoughts that do pop up into my mind, never mind my actions and my words, if I cry to him for forgiveness, if I resolve to make him my king, God will credit me with Jesus' perfect life. God will credit me with his death to pay for my sin. God will come supernaturally and live within me by his Spirit to supernaturally change me from within, to slowly stop me having those thoughts that I can't control. I will be fit for his eternal kingdom, a kingdom that is more wonderful than I thought. Christ's good news is more wonderful than I thought because it turns me from being a murderer into someone fit for heaven. Finally then, how then shall I live as a subject of this kingdom? You might remember we said this last time. I think there are two temptations when we look at God's law. The first temptation is to abolish the law. In other words, to say, well, that doesn't apply to me. Thou shalt not murder. Well, of course that doesn't apply to me. Of course I'm not a murderer. These verses show me, yes, it does apply to me. Actually, I am. The other temptation with God's law is to abuse it by using it to make me feel better about myself and look down on other people. How does that work? Well, I see certain aspects of my bad behaviour. Hey, I know I'm not perfect. And I say to myself, yeah, I know I'm not perfect, but at least I don't do that. At least I'm not a murderer. It can be quite satisfying, can't it, to compare ourselves with each other? To think, yeah, I'm doing okay. I'm doing okay. I'm not perfect, I know that, but I'm not doing what they're doing. If I use God's law to make me feel good about myself and look down on other people, that is an abuse of the law. That is not why God gave it to me. Well, at least I don't murder people. Well, actually I do. God's wonderful law, God's wonderful good news. What is the answer for me today? Surely it is for me to keep crying to God for mercy. Keep crying for Him to change me. Keep living with Him as my King. And to not even think about how to harm, or how to retaliate, or how to snub, or how to keep the flame of bitterness burning. And if I have something against someone, I must sort it.